Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Middle East Dialogue 2024. This year, we're having this conference at Villanova University, Philadelphia. And our next panel discussing is mapping methodological nationalism in Middle Eastern studies toward a transactional understanding of the 2011 Arab upsprings. And the three person who's going to give our presentation is Jonas Nabe, Ward Vlobergs, and Maïs Krutov. And they are the professors from Erasmus University of Rotterdam. Let's welcome them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. All right, does this work for you?
Thanks.
I think so.
If Zoomy can see the screen, can you type in the chat box and let me know? Do I have to share my screen?
No. I think right now it's perfect.
Okay, then please continue.
All right. So first of all, thank you so much for having us here at this this conference. We will talk about scaling the Middle East and refocusing research. So we will talk about two main themes. We will talk about different approaches to research and how to scale different research or studies. And we will talk about the monumental events of the 2011 Arab uprisings, which saw mass popular mobilization across various countries in the Middle East and North Africa. So we will divide our talk in four distinct parts. First, we will talk about research foci, so how to define and look at different ways to approach research. Afterwards, we will talk about mapping trends and distributions, entailing that we want to know how much each of those foci have been used and how we can see them. Then we will repeat our main claims that we make, or the main issues that we would invite you to think about. And in the last part, we will have a brief discussion where we also warmly invite everyone to participate and to also give their own 2 cents on the issue. So first, we will talk about research foci. We will talk about them also as we define them in our recent publication in the Digest of Middle East Studies. So to do this, first, I would invite you to think about these 2 research topics. And I would like to ask you how to reflect on the way you would approach this research, or if you would commence with a study on, for example, the regime responses to uprisings in rural cities of Tunisia. How would you define the scope and how would you scale your research? And likewise, I would also invite you to consider also the role of Facebook and Twitter, or X nowadays, in popular mobilization. And would the way that you approach number 1 and number 2, would it be the same, or would they differ a lot? For example, for number 2, would you use the same scale? Would you go smaller, bigger? This leads us to the first research focus, which is one of the options that we discuss, one of the 3. Methodological nationalism is a research focus that, ever since the Cold War era has become more and more popular, and one could even say extremely dominant in some fields of study. And this research approach almost always entails considering the state as the dominant unit of analysis and or the main actor in phenomena considered. In general, one can say about methodological nationalism that it entails the assumption that the nation as equated to the state and society is the natural, social, and political form in the modern world. There are three subforms of this tendency or this research focus, which maybe could even be a bias if it's too strict. And those three are ignorance, naturalization, and territorialization. Starting with the first one, ignorance, it entails any type of research or study approach that fails to take into account the ideological and political nature of nationalism and the conception of the state in the world as a manifestation of political processes and ideas rather than a empirical given. Failing to take this into account risks ignoring many of the very violent and complex history of states, nation states, and nationalism in general. Related to this form is naturalization, which entails the assumption that states or countries are the only or natural unit of analysis to consider when studying the world, studying politics. And the last one is territorialization, which entails equating the borders of a state to the delineations of your research. It might even imply an assumption of container societies, wherein states are considered as self-encompassing units and scales and societies, which can be contrasted to any other state units on the outside. Those three forms of methodological nationalism very often occur simultaneously and have many different manifestations in research and research foci. A very alternative way of looking at this is to consider both strengths and weaknesses, because before we mainly outlined potential weaknesses, namely the ignorance, the naturalization, and the territorialization, which can of course potentially exclude or ignore relevant variables that cross borders. There's also quite some strengths in methodological nationalist research, namely that there are very clear analytical boundaries, which makes it immediately clear to both researcher and reader what is talked about. If using a state approach, it's also quite useful to generalize them. So to compare to other outcomes or other studies or to reproduce research, this approach is very handy because most parts of the world are at least familiar with a state approach or a state level. And also, of course, it can acknowledge specific contexts taking place within a country. An alternative research focus is methodological globalism. Instead of looking at a state, we zoom out and look at the global picture. And this entails a kind of acknowledgement of a global community and prioritizes the global scale over smaller scales. And again, there are three forms or subforms of methodological globalism that we recognize in our paper. The first one of those is moral political. This is not to discuss the very complex and rich content of morality and political theory of cosmopolitanism or globalism, but this is to say that moral and political considerations are very often explicitly or implicitly motivators for a global scale of research. For example, when aiming to look at a global community or wanting to assess, for example, global risk in terms of climate change, a more broader perspective on the whole globe is sometimes necessary. And the political part can also refer to potential ways of implementing global ideas, such as global ways of governance or human rights, for example. The cultural subform of methodological globalism entails questions of identity. It entails the idea that we live in such an interconnected world that different cultural elements interact with each other and ultimately mix up to form a more global general identity of someone, rather than remaining too much attached to one local or one very specific small scale cultural way of identification. The last subform of methodological globalism is economic, which refers to any type of research that considers global capitalism or global trade, the global stock exchange, and it always admits or acknowledges that economically almost every part of the world is highly interconnected. So focusing only on a very small part of this will only mystify the findings and not help towards a completer picture of economics. There are, of course, both strengths and weaknesses of this research focus as well. While it is sensitive to global and more larger scale variables, and tends to lead to more universally applicable conclusions, because it's of course not reliant upon specificities of a very local or small scale. It also risks ignoring whatever goes on within a state. And similarly to methodological nationalism, it risks ignoring the political change and relevance of nationalism. And it also has been said sometimes that especially economic methodological globalism has a tendency to showcase international functionalism, entailing that there is an assumption that every location in the world has a somewhat static and hierarchical position for the whole globe to function as one economic system. And this staticism and sometimes hierarchy is very often criticized. If we go in between those two research foci, we can find transnationalism. This is a potential hybrid due to a potential to include multiple scopes and scales from both of the aforementioned research foci. There are again two general forms of transnationalism, which also can be combined in certain studies. So those are cross-border tracing, entailing considering or following or otherwise analyzing phenomena that span more than one national territory. We can think of examples in, for example, studying diasporas or studying multinational corporations. This can be complemented or implemented by multi-level analyses, which entail researches or studies that incorporate a plurality of analytical scopes and scales. So one can, in such a study, combine some variables which are very linked to the state, so national variables, and relate them with, for example, more transnational or global variables, and combine those findings and those variables to come to a very nuanced point that takes into consideration more than one scale. Examples can be thought of in the idea of, for example, the relation between NGOs, non-governmental organization, and local or regional legislation. Some notable strengths of transnationalism are that it's sensitive to cross-border variables that might get lost in either the smaller national scale of methodological nationalism or the larger overarching perspective of methodological globalism. It also can possibly integrate multiple localities and actors, which provides the possibility to work in a very nuanced methodology. However, it's very hard to generalize because each additional study requires just justification for every scale and each variable that is included or excluded in transnational research. And it is by no means a set solution for some of the problems of methodological nationalism, for example, because if this research still uses national variables, it still risks showing some of the problems of methodological nationalism if not addressed properly. This is a spectrum that we developed to interrelate these three research foci. So as you can see, while methodological globalism and methodological nationalism are rather far removed from each other in terms of the centrality in that the state takes, they are still placed somewhat closer to each other due to the horseshoe shape of this spectrum. And this is to signal that they are potentially more similar than they seem by, for example, both showcasing some form of ignorance when it comes to the impact of nationalism, the political and historical development of nationalism and the state ideologically and as ideological movements. And transnationalism is placed between those two to signal its potential inclusion of variables of both of the two other extremes, and the cross-border sensitivity, which places it in between the other two scales. Right now, the question is, to which extent are the discussed research foci present in scholarship about the 2011 Arab uprisings? So this part brings us also to the 2011 uprisings, which have been commented on by various scholars to be profoundly transnational or connected. That it's a protest wave. It was not merely a number of unconnected and unrelated protests coincidentally occurring around the same time. So we wanted to find out, is this also reflected in the way that research about it is focused, or is approached? To do this, we coded texts manually. So we tried to identify codes which we could connect to certain key phrases in texts. So certain assumptions, certain statements or methodologies that hint at some characteristics of one of the few considered research foci that then warrants the allocation of the text in one of the subcategories of those research foci. For example, the naturalization form of methodological nationalism, or the cultural form of methodological globalism. And then it allowed us to associate certain texts, whether it was books, chapters, or articles, to one of the three research foci that we theorized in the part before. For example, how we did this was, we saw a sentence like this, which has Egypt, which can serve as surrogate in this regard for other Arab countries, does not provide encouragement for the hypothesis of the vicious becoming a virtuous cycle. There is however, no explicit justification or explanation in this text for why exactly and how Egypt can serve as surrogate for other countries. We can see that Egypt is considered as the main unit of analysis, thereby hinting at a methodological nationalism, seeing that the territory of the state is somewhat equated to the analytical limitation of the scale of this research. And there's also another quote which says, "Less well researched is the role of the knowledge resources at the disposal of the technically trained Arab diaspora." This consideration of diaspora hints at a cross-border variable, because of course diasporas are characterized by not being limited or refrained to one nation or one national territory or one state, and as such this sentence implies a somewhat more transnational research focus. What we saw after coding like this 75 books and book articles and or book chapters, sorry, and journal articles, was that 37 of them showcase methodological nationalism. 5 of them showcase methodological globalism, and 17 of them showcase transnationalism. There were no examples that we found that could not in some way or another be placed or related to one of those research foci and could thereby not be included on the spectrum. The transparent dots that you see on the spectrum are publications that showcased more than one research foci or a combination thereof. And this also suggests a certain fluidity and a certain interrelation between those 3 research foci, also leading us to the idea that they are not three trichotomous variables. They also, in some way, are fluid. So what we wanted to do with this study and this research was to find out that research foci possess different qualities that make each of them more or less suitable for different analytical needs. And that these implications need to be discussed and considered maybe more than they are now because of the unexpected finding of the dominance of methodological nationalism in research about the 2011 Arab uprisings, which we expected was or is approached more often transnationally. This made us think about how could we address this and why is there still such a dominance of a national-based approach, also in this quite transnational occurrence and phenomenon. Of course, one role could be in education. So we think that educators can take a big role in addressing and potentially challenging this issue by engaging in the classroom or in universities with the pros and the cons of the various research foci. I think there could be much to win in terms of when people choose which focus. And by doing this, I think research can be more focused, more precise, and therefore contribute more to our overall understanding of both the Middle East, but also social phenomena and political phenomena in general. Now I will give the word.
Thank you very much, Jonas, for this very clear, I think, overview of what we did in the article that you also showed at the beginning of the presentation. I hope it is clear for everyone that this is based on a journal article that has been recently published. And I can imagine that for many of you joining us here, this is perhaps a bit disconnected from the topic of the sessions that you've attended earlier today. But I think what we would like to do in the discussion is to try and engage in a kind of interaction with all attendants. We have prepared a few questions for this discussion, and basically all these questions come down to the main conclusion that Jonas just presented, right? If we take if we make a meta-analysis of how the Arab uprisings in particular, but moreover, the field of Middle Eastern studies is being approached, we will often find this dominant trend of focusing and structuring studies from within the unit of analysis that is dominant, namely the state, nation states. And therefore, all the discussion questions that we have prepared come down to what if we question that, and what if we want to challenge that kind of perspective? What would that mean for the future of Middle Eastern studies? Right? Do we can we imagine alternatives, and do we intend to perpetuate this dominant trend? And how can we think about this? So in order to spark the discussion, and there is really an intention here to invite you to participate and to share your opinions, even if you disagree with or are having some difficulty adjusting to the level of abstraction that we're having in here. We try to make it a little bit more concrete and to visualize what we are talking about. One way we can do this is, as Jonas has mentioned, analyze the Arab uprisings that erupted in 2011 or after 2010, and then went through the region in a more or less contagious manner, spreading from Tunisia and Egypt to other countries. This is, of course, has been a major point of rupture in the field of Middle Eastern studies, and is often discussed and being analyzed up until today, very often from what I would like to call here a horizontal perspective, where we take Egypt, Yemen, and so on, as you see listed here, as one unit that needs to be understood from within this framework. And in order to understand how the uprising of the Egyptian right on Tahrir Square took place, it is important to understand what came before and what the history of Egypt, political history, looked like before this uprising. That is, of course, very relevant, but it is also questionable and limiting in a way. And that's the point Jonas has been trying to make. Maybe it is useful to analyze these uprisings also in more vertical manners, right? Whereas, of course, the horizontal level remains very relevant. We need to know something about Egypt and its specific context to understand what made the Egyptians rise up against Hosni Mubarak. But it may be equally instructive and insightful to compare the uprisings and the dynamics that drove citizens to protest against Hosni Mubarak, to compare these to the protesters who rose up against Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen, for example, or against Bashar al-Assad in Syria. And these questions, of course, remain ignored a little bit if we adopt only the horizontal dynamic of analyzing and comparing developments. So that's what we invite you to do. We want to insist and further make the point here that this perspective of looking at developments in the region from within boundaries of the state, of one single state, is and remains dominant also among scholars, experts, observers of the region, not only scholars and not only journalists, but it is very common. And of course, for some good reasons, but it is also useful to question these reasons. Here we see how, for example, Arab Reform Initiative, but there are many other knowledge platforms, think of Jadaliya or other websites that track and monitor developments in the region, also adopt this perspective that is very much country specific. I think that's the main point we want to highlight, right? Visualizing how this methodological nationalism expresses itself, if you want, not only in the scholarly literature, but also in other ways, other places. And so we want to ask you the question, do you all agree that this dominance, this methodological nationalist prism, is a form of explanatory reductionism? And we can very well imagine that you agree with this, and then we would like to hear on what grounds or what overlap you see with your own intuitions. But we can also very well accept, and we're curious to hear why you might have a different opinion and say, no, I don't agree that this nationalist perspective is reductory.
Mhm. If anyone wants to join the discussion, you can raise your hand and I will let you on the podium.
Thank you very much.
Is there any discussion regarding this question from online? Okay, here is one people.
Please go ahead. I think I saw, I'm supposing Mr. Ayman Hamza raised
Yeah,
a
you can-
hand. The first one is the most difficult, right? Please don't be shy.
You need to raise your hand and I can find you. Where is that person? Okay. Can you please unmute yourself, Ayman Hamza?
I did.
Okay. Please
Can
go
you
ahead.
hear me?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear.
Thank you very much. I actually studied at the ISS, which is now part of Rotterdam University. Thank you for being here. I would like to ask the research panelists whether they have tried to compare the uprisings in Sudan, which preceded the Arab Spring, October 1964 and April 1984, until the last uprising of December 2018 that ushered in a transitional government. For all the methodological and ontological methodologies you have used, the epistemology of Sudanese revolutions are different. By the way, I'm a speaker after the lunch break, talking about this kind of impasse in Sudan as well. So I would like to know whether you have at all endeavored to compare any of the kind of trajectories in Sudan at that, critical point in history leading to the current catastrophe. Thank you.
Okay. Shall I go first, Jonas, or you want to intervene? Thank you very much, Ayman, for your question, and happy to connect. I also had a spell at ISS, so that shapes and constitutes a very nice connection. I'm afraid that our knowledge about Sudan is currently too limited to warrant such an in-depth comparison. What I do think is that it is a very interesting and promising avenue for further research, because as a matter of fact, we have been talking within our little team here about Sudan quite often because of the 2018 and unfolding, ongoing crisis, of course, because we see that this methodological nationalist approach, research focus, we would say, persists very much, right? Now, and our urge would be, okay, but in 2019, we took it, you mentioned 2018, in this period, Sudan was not the only society that experienced this kind of protests, of dynamics, right? And our urge would be to question the overly methodological nationalist perspective. So in other words, the focus of many media and also observers to explain what was happening in Sudan only by talking about Sudan and not comparing what was happening within Sudan also to dynamics happening in or taking place in Algeria or unfolding in Iraq or in Lebanon, with which these dynamics, right, were very much connected, and there were a lot of interactions also between protest groups exchanging cues, strategies, slogans, images across these territories. And I think that that would be a very promising avenue for analyzing this. And of course, your suggestion to compare the 2018, if I understood it correctly at least, developments within Sudan with developments taking place earlier on, decades earlier on within Sudan, would also help further understanding this. But that would maintain mostly the methodological nationalist perspective within which we would be operating them. I'm not sure if that makes sense. I try to stop here and pass it on to my colleagues, or back to you, Ayman, but thank you for the stimulating question.
I would like to also add a bit on this, because I agree that it's a very interesting question. And I think here it's also very important to note that we don't claim that methodologically nationalist approaches are by definition flawed or should not exist. The only thing we are saying is that if they exist as dominantly as they have, there remains the risk of such events, also as in Sudan, for example, to be understood in isolation. And while I am not enough familiarized with the context of Sudan, I can imagine that it is, of course, Sudan has never existed in a vacuum. Neither have their citizens and governments. So of course, there's always a connection and interaction with others, and most likely some of the dynamics that took place either right before or right after or during those upheavals are in no doubt inspired or connected to developments elsewhere or outside of Sudan. So in that sense, I think that it's not so much a question of preventing methodological nationalism completely, but complementing it by other alternatives to such an extent that it loses its kind of dominance in the field, if that makes sense.
And maybe we could return the question to you, since you are an expert on Sudan, whereas we are not. So you're more familiar with literature that has been published on political history of Sudan. Would you say, Aman, that a lot of research on the political history of Sudan is using this methodological nationalist approach? Or do you see for this specific case a more variation of research foci being used?
Yeah, can I speak now? Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, we have so many studies, over the years about the revolutions in Sudan. There are series, as I just mentioned. We have been talking about people who are participant observers. Of course, you are familiar with all the research methodologies, coming from some kind of, insider knowledge, talking about the revolution and how it transpired and how it expanded and how it is brutally being, aborted. In the three cases I mentioned of the uprisings, they were all aborted by coups. That's why the definition and the methodologies used are all the time either from an economic kind of perspective, like how the marginalization is leading to all these uprisings, or political. For example, the 1964 uprising was because of the south, of Sudan problem. As you know, now Sudan has ceased to be one country. In 2011, South Sudan ceased and delinked and became an independent country. So political approaches, military and strategic approaches, and the most important is economic approaches. As you are aware, Sudan is endowed with a lot of resources, natural resources, vast amounts of minerals, gold, uranium, lead, even silicon. The silicon in Sudan is the most pure in the world. And you have all the other people who are scrambling. As you know, it is part of Africa. Sudan is part of the scramble for Africa. If you see why we are not having the methodological approaches you are talking about at a theoretical kind of endeavor, philosophical, to be honest with you, it is a philosophy. But according to philosophers, if the philosophy cannot stand the scrutiny of time, it can err on its own proposition, but it cannot stay to be not having any relevance to the present. Our way of looking at this unfolding, continuing, persevering kind of revolutions is because of the things I just talked to you about. Either it is political or economic or military strategic, but now it has become global. The crushing of any democratic kind of thing to happen in the region. For example, we are south of Egypt. We are bordering Gulf countries. And these are some kind of regimes who will never tolerate any democratization. Now, our analysis have to go, if I were you, beyond the geographical boundaries of the countries you just listed. They are not working in isolation. There are geopolitical, geostrategic kind of things informing what is happening in the Arab world. You have grand designs like the big Arab and Middle East, without boundaries because of resources like water, like arable land, fertile grounds, like minerals, like security imperatives, like you need now to see about the Red Sea and what the Houthis are doing in Yemen, what Sudan mercenaries are doing, helping KSA and the UAE in its fight, why we are afraid of the Iranian connection. Right now, I'm listening to you and my colleague is talking about Gaza and Israel in the other room. We have to connect these things to see why these uprisings in the individual discrete countries are not getting any kind of momentum. They were all crushed, and now we are back to autocratic regimes, because one of the things driving this is the globally informed impacts and implications. Look at the environment and the global warming. If rivers are drying, nobody's going to be talking about democracy. We're going to be talking about the security of Israel, how it's going to be having its food security and the fresh water, how it's not going to be having any ideological kind of threat from Iran or Hezbollah or Hamas. It has not anything to do with the aspiration of the youth and the nation of these countries for democratization at all. It is an imposed world order. It is not voluntary for us to go and do the uprisings and persevere and die and be killed, maimed, kidnapped. Up to now, we are not counting the people who we lost and we don't know where they are, because the might of the international regime itself, what we call international law. I was in The Hague in December. I went specifically to have some kind of access to the International Criminal Court. I went, to see why there is the International Court and International Criminal Court. They are there, but there is a difference in the letter and the spirit of international law. You are telling me, for example, now the revolution in Sudan, we are seeing genocide. Then you have some laws and ordinances saying that this is genocide, but where is the implementation of the protection of those civilians who are facing genocide? The spirit and the law and the letter of the law are not systematic, and they are not systematic actually in also dealing about atrocities in geographical areas. Sudan is not going to be treated like Gaza. We have not seen a single campaign or a single video or a single mention even about Sudan, even in this conference, since it started. We are buried under the ashes of Ukraine and Gaza and other places. We heartily support all these nations around the world and in these two regions I mentioned. But people in Sudan, if you are saying the executive deputy of UNICEF last time in February in Munich said this war in Sudan is a crisis willfully ignored by the international community. And if you are deemed ignored, it means that you are not existent. People don't want to think about you, but actually, as I am going to say in my presentation after the lunch break, we matter because geopolitically and strategically and in terms of security, we matter to the world. Either they actually come to grips with what is happening in Sudan, or they are going to be in very deep waters. It's really very important that people consider what is happening. We are living in the same globe, and whatever uprising and whatever threat about terrorism now coming because of the chaos in Sudan and the collapse of the state and the dispersal of the nation, they must matter in the global arena. Thank you.
Thank you for your contribution. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other perspective regarding this question?
I see your question in the Q&A by Ahmad Ullah Farahad. Excuse my pronunciation. I see methodological globalism, if more accurate than nationalism, since strong effects and interactions are found between uprisings in Arab countries. My question is, do you have a study to explain why all revolution stakeholders didn't and still don't have a joint plan in their country for democratic transformation? I would actually say that I completely agree with you, that we do indeed see many connections and interactions. And there are some examples of joint efforts, or at least some cross-border aid, communication, and sharing of, for example, demonstration strategies, etc. For example, in Egypt and Tunisia in 2011, I have read that the marches to Tahrir Square were at least also in part planned with some kind of communication with some Tunisian protesters. And it's a very good question why there is still not a concrete and a comprehensive working together. And this, of course, would be beneficial, although we also see that there's also regime learning. So also regimes wanting to prevent change, also indirect, and perhaps share strategies in the same way as protesters would do. I don't know if you have something to add. Or
maybe Bart, you have something to add since you added a article?
Yeah, thank you very much, Ahmadullah, for your question, and interesting. It's an interesting perspective. First of all, my immediate answer would be there is this interesting article by John Shallcraft, well-known scholar of the Middle East, on what he calls revolutionary weakness, right? He uses a Gramscian perspective to look at various, from a bottom-up perspective, very much assessment, basically, of what explains this weakness of protest groups and forces across the countries to unite and manage a successful challenge to the rulers in their respective countries. of course, that is a Gramscian perspective, and with all the benefits and the limits that it can have. I think, and I'm not sure, but I would prefer a transnational perspective, and try to adopt, right, a transnational comparison across several countries. That would be my intuition if I were to take this your challenge as a new departure point for a new study. So transnational rather than methodological globalism. I think there's another good methodological globalist perspective, that is Adam Haniyeh, which you may know, who has this book, Money, Markets, Monarchies, something like that, about the political economy of the Gulf countries in other Arab countries. And I think Dr. Iman, who spoke before about Sudan, also highlighted very well the connections between what is ongoing in Sudan and how that is tied up with political economy, and actors basically being based remotely but intervening in and shaping thereby the balance of forces between pro and anti-regime forces in different Arab countries. That would be an additional complement to. So I would urge, and intuitively, I would prefer a transnationalist perspective, but I think the methodological globalism makes a lot of sense, and there have been at least two that I can think of now, examples of scholarship that have endorsed this. So I think your intuition is very welcome and right. I hope that answers the question. Otherwise, I suggest we move on to our next question, but I don't want to.
Yes. So our research focused on research articles and chapters that studied the Arab uprisings of 2011, but we see the tendency to methodological nationalism, not only in academic texts, but also in the media and also in education. So we found a few headlines that show this tendency to methodological nationalism, that media outlets oftentimes in their headlines focus on a nationalist link to the public of the media outlet. So French newspapers focus on French nationals that have died in the Hamas-Israel war, or during the horrific Turkey earthquake. US newspapers focus on US casualties in this earthquake. Also recently in the Netherlands, when the war in Gaza just started, a lot of attention went out to a single boy, young man, Ofer Engel, that had a connection to a Dutch family, and he gained the Dutch nationality really quickly in the hope to get him free. And the news about this war in the Netherlands was very much focused on this individual, just because he had a link to the Netherlands. So we see this tendency of methodological nationalism not only in academic texts, but also in media texts. And we are wondering what prevents us, not only academics, but also teachers and also journalists, from using alternative research foci, even though oftentimes it seems to make more sense to take on this more meta perspective of what is going on in these instances. And we are interested in hearing your thoughts about this. So why do you think that automatically we tend to use methodological nationalist approach instead of other research foci?
Is there anybody online who wants to join this discussion?
Otherwise, I can also give a thought on this. I think that this type of nationalism, methodological nationalism, is not only tied to methodology. This is not only a question of, okay, what kind of scale should I use for certain research, but it's also much more personal, because this idea of nationality also is to a large extent connected to identity and governance and day-to-day life. Sorry. And I think this is very important to realize that methodological nationalism is deeply, deeply grounded in not only research, but also our feelings of identity and our day-to-day experience. And I think this could be one of the reasons why it is so widespread and difficult to address directly.
Thank you. We still have 5 more minutes for this discussion. So we will end at 12:40.
Then I think we can move on to one last question to think about when you go. I think maybe I can give the floor to Bart for this last one.
Photo bomb?
Sure. Thank you very much, Jonas. Yeah, we were wondering, and I hope you are still with us, because I can imagine this is about this article, and our research is, of course, on a very detached, I mean, at least more conceptual or abstract level, less empirically rooted, and we are looking, nevertheless, to make this connection to the real world also, but still from this methodological perspective. And from that angle, it is important to try and imagine an alternative for the methodological nationalist dominant trend. So we try to think up a couple of possibilities to visualize what an alternative approach, right, research approach could look like. And one example that would depart very much from a nationalist perspective would be a typically transnational topic. And Jonas already mentioned diaspora studies as going into that direction. But here, the Kurdish struggle for statehood, but also the various divisions, of course, within among Kurdish communities, I should say, provide such an interesting alternative approach to research. And so we are wondering whether that would be a more promising avenue for research. We're not sure. We're just making a kind of suggestion. And in doing so, we are really trying to highlight that it may be useful to challenge the methodological nationalist trend, which is so dominant. We are not saying that it is per se a bad thing, right? It can be very useful, in particular in comparisons, and that is important. But we are asking researchers, observers, media, to make sure to think about what the most appropriate scope and scale, as Jonas put it, of analysis really is, depending on the topic that people are studying or wish to study. Right? In the case of the uprisings, we believe that methodological nationalism was a counterintuitive choice to make, sorry. And that is why we think, right? Why do we think it was a misguided choice? Well, simply because it is a dynamic, like the 2019 uprisings showed again, that were very much connected amongst them. And the current dynamics in the region also warrant a much more interconnected transnational perspective. We cannot understand the events in Gaza or in Sudan or in Libya or in any other country without paying attention to dynamics that are also going on in other countries. This seems today, at the end of a presentation like this, may seem like an evident conclusion, but unfortunately the reality still is that many researchers, observers, journalists, experts on the region still continue to use this framework of the nation state as the main unit of their analysis and explanation. And so the discussion here is basically an invitation to all students of the region to reconsider which research approach, which focus is most appropriate depending on the topic they're choosing, right? Not immediately, automatically, blindly resorting to using the nationalist methodological framework of the nation state, but rather consider whether a transnationalist or methodological globalist perspective could be equally or even more useful. I hope that triggers some, and that resonates somehow with some of you. If you are interested in these discussions, then please don't hesitate to get in touch or send us your comments, your observations, your objections are also very much welcome. I want to thank you and maybe hand over the floor to Jonas and Marise to add a few comments. And of course, I thank the organizers for hosting us and giving us the opportunity to present this here.
Okay.
Thank you, Bart. I also just want to thank the organization and hope that our talk today in some way gets interpreted as we meant it, which is an invitation to exactly think about and consider and also discuss amongst each other with us about this phenomenon of research foci.
Okay.
And
Thank you everybody for coming today, and the lunch and refreshment will be provided at the first floor, and we will end our morning session right now, and we will be continuing our afternoon session at 2 p.m. You can go back to the program detail and click join the stream for our afternoon session. Thank you, and I will see you afternoon. Bye-bye.
Enjoy the lunch. Bye-bye. Thank you.
thank you.